Hi everyone, I'm Chris Schneider. I'm currently working at the Contilia Heart and Vascular Center at the Elizabeth Hospital in Essen. This is a follow-up recording of a talk within a session training load monitoring in elite sports, concepts, challenges, and applications. And I had the pleasure and pressure to deliver the first starting talk or the opening talk on the topic of training load monitoring. What are we actually talking about and why? You can find all slides of this presentation at the Open Science Framework following the QR code or the link. And everything in my presentation, which is highlighted in blue, you can click on it and there's a hyperlink between or behind it. And so you can access all the resources, or at least the websites of the resources. So my talk is split in two main parts. First of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about training load monitoring? What is a training load construct and what are potential measures and metrics? And then the second part, I will briefly touch on possible applications, challenges, and also on opportunities. But especially the last 2 points, the challenges and the opportunities, they were largely addressed by the two subsequent talks in the session at the Sports Medicine and Health Summit in 2023 in Hamburg by Annie Hextaden on how to harness data to inform decision. And the final talk was delivered by Sean McLaren. Welcome to the real world. So first of all, what are we talking about? What is the construct of training load monitoring? Training load was first used since the 1980s, roughly, in a very colloquial way, to indicate the amount of training. For example, citation was like VO2 max initially increased, but then failed to increase further, even in the presence of an increased training load. And if we do the regular PubMed searches, we do see that the term training load was mentioned in titles and abstracts quite frequently from the 1980s onwards. And one of the earlier applications were by Eric Bannister, where he used the concept of training or training load, or he called it back then training impulse. And he used this in his model to predict, or in different models to predict model performance, basically. The starting point was that he looked at the training of swimmers. He calculated the loads lifted in the weight training and also the volumes in different swimming intensity zones. And the assumption of this original model for predicting performance was that training had positive effects for example, increasing physical capabilities and also increasing skill. At the same time, each training session or each training load also has negative effects such as fatigue, and the combination of the positive and negative effects and other factors would result in the observable performance. And some of the data looked like this. So he started with measures of training load, or as I mentioned before, he called that training impulse. So basically quantification of the training. And then based on this input, he modeled the output, the positive training effects, and the negative fatigue effects. And based on the combination of positive and negative effects after training, he then gets the prediction of performance, and he compared the performance prediction with the actual measured performance. First in a validation period, basically, or in a modeling period, and then he used also the values to predict performance in the future and compared that with performance measures in the future. And so this was one of the earliest applications where training load, or the concept of training load, was basically used in a similar fashion as we understand it today. His model, his understanding was then further developed and, for example, visualized and conceptualized in such a way. So starting point is the training load. Then we have positive fitness effects, negative fatigue effects, and some additional factors. And based on the combination of positive and negative, we get a performance outcome. Aaron Coutts in 2018 visualized it in such a fashion, looking at the training process in general. We have the training plan, then execute the training dose, or the training load, for example. Then we observe responses, positive and negative, and get the performance outcomes. And at the latest point, from the performance outcomes, we then can go back and modify the training plan to reach our aims as intended. However, a further very important separation when we talk about training load is not just understand that this is basically the starting point or the input from responses that we're maybe interested in. It's that we can further separate external and internal training loads. And this is a conceptualization by Franco and Pellizzeri and colleagues, where basically the training process consists of different aspects, and external training loads can be described in quality and quantity of training, as well as training organizational aspects. And in combination with individual characteristics of an athlete, we then get a resulting internal training load. An internal training load is then responsible for the training outcomes of the training process. And of course, we can use different physiological measures to try to observe internal loads and training outcomes. After 15 years, he further developed his conceptualization, also included the aspects of performance, the resulting determinants, and then the resulting training goals, which lead to training planning in these different aspects. After training planning, we come to the training execution of and observable external loads. The internal loads are then reflective of the external load in combination with individual characteristics, training status, psychological status, health, nutrition, environment, and genetics. And based on this, we observe, of course, from a similar external load, we can observe different and varying internal loads, and we can, based on the same internal load, observe varying adaptations. And these adaptations are relevant for the training outcomes that we often try to influence with all our training planning and execution. And based on these outcomes, we then can go back to adjust and modify training goals, which hopefully have an effect on performance in the broader sense. And in addition to separating external and internal loads, there's also an important aspect, which has, for example, been described by Toigo and Boutillier, that we, in many, many cases, to properly describe training load, we need multiple exercise descriptors. So, for example, we have in each training session various training descriptors of external load, for example, to properly document what actually has been done. And based on the how they called it, the response matrix, we get different internal loads and internal responses, signal transduction, which then leads to the specific adaptations and the adaptational effects. And so it can be multidimensional and very, very complicated, potentially, or at least complex. And this is the, I think, most useful framework that has been conducted or has been presented, at least in the current literature, on the entire process of the physical training. And this model was described and published by Annie Jeffries and colleagues. And the starting point is obviously the training plan, the training prescription. Then external training load is executed, and this is what has been done by the athletes. We then observe the internal training loads, or internal training loads are a result of external loads and other things. This results in training effects, and we can separate training effects and positive and negative effects based on the outcomes of interest, and acute and chronic effects. And as you can see here, obviously we also have various measures to describe various aspects of training effects. And based on the training effects, then there results performance out. Then there are and the training effects result performance outcomes. Performance outcomes are typically described as staying similar, so no changes in performance. Performance can improve, performance can decrease. And in the fatigue literature and overtraining literature, the decrements, performance decrements, are typically separated from functional overreaching over non-functional overreaching until overtraining syndromes. But that's not enough. All of these different aspects, from execution to internal load to training effects to outcomes, can be influenced and typically are influenced by individual and contextual factors. And these arrows in this model indicate causal relationships, or the assumed causal relationships. So external load causes internal load, causes training effects. All of this can also be influenced by an individual training status, health status, heat, for example, altitude, and so on. But also the training facts, things like positive adaptation, fatigue, and so on, can manifest as an individual factor, which is then an influencing factor for the external load and the internal load of the next training session. So there's an interrelationship between internal loads which can have an effect at training effects, but training effects can also influence, of course, the individual, which then can lead to changes in an experience of training loads and performance outcomes. And training load monitoring, this is the topic of this session, is basically focusing on the first aspects, the input of the training process. And the construct of training load can be described as a higher order construct, so a bidimensional construct, reflecting the amount of physical training that is done and experienced by the athlete. And here we have these two dimensions at least. The external training load is a description of what the athletes do, what the athlete does. And the experience is the internal training load. So the internal to the body responses during exercise. And there's a very important separation. So internal training load is only during exercise, not after exercise. After exercise, we call that training effects. And at least based on these two sub-constructs and based on the things that we discussed before, it's also clear that training load accommodates a variety of measures from various natures. However, it's not that clear or not that such a strong consensus. There has been recently some debate and criticism of the training load terms and the concepts. For example, Craig Staunton finally published in 2022 criticized that load is also a term that is used in mechanical aspects or in mechanical areas. Therefore, we should use SI-derived units to describe the load, so newtons. And therefore, the current use of the term load and also training load in result is unscientific and should be abandoned. There's also some criticisms, or there was some criticisms by Lewis Pasfield and colleagues on the validity of the training load concept. Basically, they were criticizing that lots of training load measures, or at least several of training load metrics, lack proper validation, and many of the training load calculations are inappropriate, biased. However, I believe there were some very valid and good responses on these original criticisms by the two author groups, mainly led by Franco Imblizeri and lots of colleagues. So I believe we can still use the concept of training load. This is still appropriate and scientific, and I will give you some main arguments and some main explanations on why this is the case and how we can conceptualize this in the following slide. So basically, the training load term, to sum this up before we go on, is the training load term is equivalent to dose in other areas, and it also conveys the idea that there are demands challenging the organism. So what are we talking about? Basically, from this typical conceptualization, first of all, training load is just a term. It's just a label that is assigned to a multi-dimensional construct. Then, based on this construct that we have in mind and based on the label that we use to just give it a name, we then need a constitutive definition. And the constitutive definition is, as described earlier, training load is a higher order construct reflecting the amount of physical training. And after this definition, we can further operationalize what we actually try to measure or what we try to conceptualize. And based on these operational definitions, we can define measures, then we can validate the measures to see if they are actually and properly measuring what we aim to measure. So first of all, there's no problem at all if we conceptualize it in a proper way and tell everyone what we're meaning with the different terms, definitions, and metrics. In respect to external and internal load, we have basically training load as the overarching construct. We have these two subdimensions, the two subconstructs of external and internal load. And we would then go on with the specific definitions and the operationalization from the two subdimensions. And then after all this has been done, and if we then validated the different metrics for specific question, we can then say, yes, we have valid metrics for the specific questions or not. Otherwise, in general, I believe, I'm a strong proponent of the argumentation from Franco Imblizeri and colleagues that we actually don't have a problem if we do it in a right way, if we conceptualize it in a right way, and if we then do the validations as needed. And a further analogy is basically that training load can be understood as an exposure and dose. And therefore, in sport and exercise science, training load, the construct of training load would be more or less equivalent to the construct of exposure to an agent in occupational and environmental epidemiology or toxicology, where external training load would reflect the distal cause, internal load would reflect the proximal cause, and therefore the mediator for the responses that are typically interesting to us. And if you understand training load as exposure and dose, we again, or at least I believe we again don't have any problems if we conceptualize the constructs and the measures in such a causal manner. So what could potential measures and metrics of training load look like? And for example, on a physiological perspective, typical external load measures that are used are things to describe kinetic energy, such as training distance, speed thresholds, time and speed thresholds, and also the construct of, or the concept of metabolic power and the measures of metabolic power, although they are aimed at describing the energy expenditure. From my understanding, nevertheless, they are based on external load measures, and therefore they're also a measure of external load, although they are talking about internal load, but that's just a model. Physiological measures of internal training load would be the classical ones of oxygen consumption, basically in a lab, but also cardiovascular ones like heart rate, blood lactates, or ratings of perceived exertion. On a biomechanical perspective, external training loads could be ground reaction forces to describe the overall body load, but also magnitude and frequencies of acceleration, decelerations, and there are various measures or metrics on the market from consumer devices such as the player load, I believe from Catapult or so. An internal load would be, and there it gets more tricky, typically measures of joint contact forces, for example, also muscle tendon forces, and obviously this is quite difficult to get measures during practice of these concepts. So probably in the area of biomechanical internal loads, we need to rely on external loads to predict what we believe might be the case, because it's very, very difficult until impossible currently to get direct measures of internal biomechanical loads. And as mentioned before, in many cases, we probably need various variables to describe a training session in a sufficiently detailed manner. So for example, there was a proposal by Martin Bouchet and Paul Lawson that we need at least 9 variables to define high intensity sessions. So for example, we need the intensity and duration and work modality of the intervals that are being performed, as well as intensity and duration of the relief periods, number of series, time between series, the series duration, and between series recovery intensities. If we skip some of these, we are not talking about, or we potentially are not talking about the same training sessions. In resistance training, there were also various measures. So for example, if we just look at the typical descriptors, such as two people are doing training sessions at 70/5 of 1 rem, 6 repetitions twice a week for 10 weeks, it still could be vaguely different. If someone is performing 2 seconds of shortening and 2 seconds of lengthening during every execution of during every repetition, compared to another athlete who is doing 10 seconds of shortening, 2 seconds of isometric, and 4 seconds of lengthening. And if the athletes reach fatigue or failure or not, and obviously just if we use some or few of these typical descriptors of resistance training, there still could be various variations within the training sets, for example, and obviously this would lead to different internal loads, to different responses, to different training outcomes. So if we want to understand those response relationships properly, we obviously need to be very precise about the training load description. A very important thing that many people or many practitioners are interested in is trying to get some measures of cumulative exposure. So we're not just interested in how long is the training session, what is the average intensity, but also get a better understanding of what is the overall load of a given training session or a training week. And there comes the concept of the cumulative exposure, which is also similar to the things that Eric Bannister did in the beginning. And here's an example of how heart rate data could be quantified based on Edwards in 1993 using the training impulse concept. So basically, we, as just mentioned, not just look at the average heart rate of a training session, we look at time of heart rate spent in different intensity zones. So for example, there were roughly 2 3/4 minutes in this 30-minute training session where the athlete was had heart rates above 90% of peak heart rate. There were roughly 7 minutes in intensity zones. Oh no, sorry, I was wrong. Roughly 3 minutes in intensity zone 50 to 60% of peak heart rate. Roughly 7 minutes in zone 5 from 90 to 100% peak heart rate. And based on the time spent in the different intensity zones, each intensity zones get a different weighing factor. So zone 5 gets a weighing factor of 5, zone 3 gets a weighing factor of 3, and zone 1 by 1. And then we multiply and accumulate everything, and then we get an overall measure of training impulse. So how demanding was a training session? Spending more time in higher intensities is more demanding, more stressful, basically, than spending time at lower intensities. And this concept is very, very common for many training load metrics. And this is also a similar concept used for the very popular and most common method, the session RPE method, which is basically the definition training load in arbitrary units is the multiplication of training minutes multiplied by the rating of perceived exertion from the typical CR10 scale, either from Borg or, as Carl Foster proposed it, from a modified category ratio scale. So this could be a potential or a possible training week. In the first day on Sunday, 3 hours of cycling at an average or a session RPE of 5. That makes a training load of 900 units. Mondays, 2 hours of weight training, high intensity, so a session RPE of 7. That would make 840 training load units, arbitrary units, and so on and so far. And based on this description of different training sessions, one thing that sticks to the mind is that it's quite nice because we can combine the different training contents that athletes do. We are not, we don't have to rely on kilometers, for example, which are only possible in various endurance exercises. We can also include weight training and so on and so forth. So that's one benefit of using the session RPE method, because we can combine and describe various training sessions of different nature. Based on measures like this, we can, for example, look at the average load for a given day or for the average day in a week. We can look at the day-to-day variability as a quantification of standard deviation or expressed as training monotony. We can look at overall loads over the week and so on and so forth. So why are we doing this? What are potential application challenges and opportunities that we all do all this work of conceptualizing, choosing metrics, and then trying to validate metrics? Potential application could be training prescription. So for example, you can see here an exemplary training plan from a high-intensity interval training overload microcycle that has been used in some of our studies, where basically the different running-based high-intensity sessions are described. For example, day 3, early in the morning, we had straight line runs, so no changes in direction, 4 times 4 minutes at 80% of peak velocity at the 30-15 intermittent fitness test, with passive rest of 3 minutes in between sessions. Day 4, afternoon, 40-meter shuttle. So we had changes of direction, 2 series of 12 repetitions, each 30 seconds long at 90% of velocity of peak velocity at the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. Passive rest between runs, between shuttle runs of 30 seconds, and passive rest between series of 3 minutes. We can also use measures of training load to describe what has been done during a session. So for example, you can see here heart rate sessions, heart rate recordings from 2 different training sessions. We do see different patterns. We do see different peak heart rates. In addition to just describing this and looking at different patterns to see did it work in a similar fashion as we intended it to be, we can also quantify the time spent in different intensity zones, and as mentioned before, could try to calculate cumulative exposure measure such as training impulse. to compare different sessions. We can also do training analysis and explore how are different sports how do sports differ, for example, in annual training volume. What is the intensity distribution if we choose different metrics? We could look at relative training intensity distribution in a given sport for the different training periods. These are all potential applications. We can also try to compare planning versus execution. There were some studies describing training planning versus execution in team sports. And for example, one of these findings were that players executed the easy training days too hard compared to what the coaches intended. And the hard days were not executed hard enough. And this, of course, can inform training planning and training execution. And I believe it's interesting and helpful to you to know such informations, or potentially could be helpful. Furthermore, as described before, it could be used as an input variable to model and predict performance or training effects. However, we of course have some challenges. So very important challenge, and we will also touch, or this will also be touched or was touched in the subsequent talks. Some of these challenges are, for example, okay, we have lots of options available, but how do we actually select and validate what are the appropriate measures and metrics? And what has to be clear is that this can be very, very context and question specific. For example, heart rate might be or is probably a very valid measure for continuous endurance exercise. Heart rate is probably less valid, or heart rate metrics or heart rate derived metrics are probably less valid for high intensity interval training because the metabolic aspects are not so good captured. And heart rate is probably a very poor measure for describing training loads during strength training, for example. So it can be context and question specific. Also, of course, as mentioned in the examples from biomechanical loads, we need to see, or the potential challenges could be what technologies are available. So for example, although potentially in weightlifting, measures of internal force load or joint loads of torques would be very interesting and probably more interesting than just looking at the weights lifted. Maybe, maybe not, depends on the training phase, for example. Nevertheless, we don't have technologies available to actually quantify internal training loads, and that's, of course, a problem. Can we afford the costs of the relevant technologies to give us the measures that we're interested in, and are these feasible and scalable? Obviously, in many practical settings, we have substantial challenges with dealing with small sample sizes. Training groups, teams are probably relatively small, especially if we look at subgroups, if we only look at the forwards within a team, and we have lots of problems with missing data. If the heart rate strap is not working well, if it was left at home, or if it's just broken and I cannot record from several sessions, how will I be able to look at accumulated load of a training week? How will I cope with the missing data? And also in many team sports, the availability and the compatibility with other applications in other teams, international teams, national teams. Typically, we don't get data, or at least we don't get data that are compatible to the data that we have. And this might be challenging depending on the questions we have and the types of analysis that we typically do. Further challenges within this area is the area of data analysis, data modeling, and also using cutoff values. This was also part of Annie Hexteden's talks. Unfortunately, not recorded here. So for example, we need to decide on, are we looking and analyzing single data versus multiple data? How do we define on the relevant reference values, and what are potential baseline values? How can they be defined in a different setting, in different metric for different metrics? If we use cutoff values to make a clear-cut decision above or below average or whatever, we always have to make a trade-off of false positive versus false negative results. And one example challenge is the application of training load to predict injury, and a very common aspect that is still relevant in the field because it's still used, although it should not be used anymore, is the acute to chronic workload ratio. The acute to chronic workload ratio basically is a comparison of the acute loads, typically in the current microcycle. So for example, the total running distance in the current week. So for example, 100 kilometers per week in the current week, compared to the weekly running loads in the last mesocycle. So for example, in the last 4 weeks. And if I only ran an average of 50 kilometers per week in the last month, and this week I'm running 100 kilometers, my acute to chronic workload ratio would be 2 times higher workloads this week than the last month, for example. And this is a relationship that has been proposed between the acute to chronic workload ratio and the likelihood of subsequent injury, where higher acute to chronic workloads, so higher loads in this week than what has been prepared for, results in increased injury risk, and there's potentially a sweet spot around 1. However, this model was described and used very, very often in the literature, is in many, many training settings. But this model is very problematic at best, and it definitely should not be used. There are various problems with this, just a few examples and lots of literature here, which you can take a look at. The main problems is that we have lack of theory, we have difficulties in analysis and statistics, the definitions in the studies, how to define an injury and at which time an injury is still relevant, related to the current acute to chronic workload ratio, is highly problematic, and various meta-analysis came to the conclusion, or at least one larger meta-analysis came to the conclusion, that all of the proposed model actually lack evidence if we take a little bit closer look. Nevertheless, what are the opportunities? And this is basically the take-home message, if I have a take-home message. So why are we monitoring training load? I believe we have the idea in mind, or the opportunity to support and optimize training. And from a causal perspective, optimizing training would imply that we are able to actively manipulate the external training load to then generate specific internal loads which influence in a positive way the outcomes of interest. And if we're able to do this, we, I think, are in a good situation, or at least this is the opportunity that we may have. However, we need, if we pick the measures of training load, we need to pick them very wisely based on plausible relationships with the mechanism of interest. If I'm calculating heart rate, or if I'm collecting heart rate to predict specific training outcomes to then inform me about specific performance outcomes, we need to have a plausible relationship between these measures. And obviously, we need evidence supporting this plausible relationship. If we don't have it, and basically we don't have it for all of the commercial metrics, or for most of the commercial metrics on the market, we have a problem, and we should be very resistant to blindly applying them in practice. However, the very important aspects of the session, the important take-home messages, were unfortunately delivered in the other talks. So maybe we read something from Annie Hexteden and Sean McLaren on these topics in the future. Nevertheless, thanks for listening. I hope it was still a little bit useful to getting the basics, to understanding the basics of training load and training load monitoring. How can we conceptualize this, and what are potential applications? So thanks, and especially I want to thank the organizers of the Sports Medicine in Health Summit in Hamburg, which was a very great conference, and also the chairs, Alex Ferrauti and Annie Hexteden, of this session, and all colleagues that have been involved with all of the work of training load and athlete monitoring, which was the basis of this presentation, and also discussions beforehand to prepare the presentation. And again, if you're interested, take a look at the slides. Everything is referenced. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper, don't hesitate to look at the Open Science Framework, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or feedback. Also, critical feedback is highly welcome. Thanks a lot, and see you soon.